My guest today is Rabbi Emily, a Canadian rabbi who started her rabbinical career here in the UK at Edgware Hindon Reform Synagogue, at that time known as Edgware District Reform Synagogue, where she was the first female rabbi. She is now the associate rabbi at West London Synagogue. Rabbi Emily, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this, so I'm feeling very excited right now.
You put too much pressure on the whole thing. um, so you work at West London Synagogue, and part of your job as the rabbi there is meeting with prospective converts to Judaism and assisting them in their conversion process, which involves teaching classes in various subjects. Now, this also involves teaching them about anti-Semitism. How do you go about teaching like such a sensitive topic?
I think it's a huge challenge because obviously the first thing you want to do whenever someone comes to you, whether they were born Jewish or are choosing Judaism as an adult, you want to respond to them with, excitement and joy and welcome because it's such an exciting thing. I mean, it happens all the time in my community that people have an experience in their life and it sparks something within them that makes them want to come to a synagogue to actively become Jewish, whether that's returning to religious practices that they sort of lost over their lives or whether it's taking on new religious practices. The last thing you want to do is start talking about things that might make them second guess it
Yeah.
or might make them fearful or might unnerve them in some way. So we know we have that responsibility that they have to learn about this particular thing because it will come up in their lives, sadly. But we try to do it in such a way that it's balanced out with all of the positives that they'll get from living a religiously, culturally, wonderfully Jewish life.
Mm.
So I think we try to balance it by learning a lot about history and a lot about what the roots of anti Semitism are. It's different depending on the cultures you were raised in. So, my experience of anti Semitism is different than someone who was born in Britain's experience of anti Semitism. And we try to make sure that we check in at several points throughout the process to say, have you experienced this? Have you seen something like this? Do you know what language to use to describe it? Because sometimes it's obvious anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's much less
Mm.
obvious, or it's a weird feeling that they get when they're in a situation. And so we try to keep having those conversations with them as they're going through the process of learning. But it is a real challenge because it goes back, many hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And to catch them up with all that history is daunting,
Mm.
but important.
What are some of the key bits of history that you think if I can only teach them these two or three things, it's got to be these bits. I know I'm asking you to narrow down thousands of years and 17 to two or three bits, but
Well, I think there's a couple of points along the way that are really important. Two have to do with minor holidays.
hmm,
So the first one is partially this is my own, nerdy bit of history that I love, which is the Second Temple period. And so I really want them to know who Antiochus IV Epiphanes was. And that's probably not a name that too many born Jews walk around knowing, but he was the ruler of the Seleucids, so he was in control of the territory that includes Jerusalem. And so he and his soldiers were sort of around back at the time when we were still worshiping in the temple. And he was the first ruler that sort of showed up and um, had a real drive to dismantle Jewish religion and cultural practices. And that's actually where we get the holiday of Hanukkah from.
hmm.
Antiochus IV Epiphanes was really the guy that the Maccabees were fighting against in order to reclaim territory so that they could
Yeah.
practice. So I want them to understand that anti-Semitism goes back a really long time, or this idea of anti-Jewish sentiment goes back a really long time.
Mm.
It's not a modern phenomena. We've been up against it many times. And that brings us to the second minor holiday, which is Purim. And Purim, historically speaking, did it actually happen? Probably not. I would doubt that it was a historically accurate retelling that we get in the Book of Esther. But I think this idea that there was a foe who opposed Jewish life and Jewish belief and Jewish people themselves, I think that's very realistic, sadly, as we've seen throughout history. And the idea that there are opportunities to stand up for yourself against such foes is really powerful. And that's why we still have Chanukah and Purim as celebrated holidays to this day. And then the third one, I would say, is to have an understanding of the Holocaust,
Mm.
who the Holocaust affected, and with that also a recognition that for many Sephardi families, the Holocaust is not necessarily emotionally relevant, and they have their own times and periods throughout history where they struggled as well, but they may not have the connection to the Holocaust that an Ashkenazi family might have.
Yeah.
So I think those are the three moments through history where I really want people to have a good understanding of what happened to us as a people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that two out of those three are festivals because, as sort of it's kind of a jokey saying among Jews, the festival is, every festival is they killed us, we survived, let's eat. And it's
Yeah,
interesting because really the root of a lot of festivals are born out of surviving these hardships because people tried to kill us and for whatever reason we're still here.
yeah. I mean, it is truly remarkable that we are still here.
Yeah.
Um, because there's plenty of ancient empires that rose and fell and do not still exist in the same form today. I mean, obviously Jews don't exist in the same form they did all that long ago, but we do have so many links that are still, just as they were thousands of years ago, including the reading of Torah, for example.
Mm.
That shows this chain of tradition that we like to talk about that's been ongoing ever since.
How do you think we have managed to keep this lineage going when so many have tried to wipe it out? What makes the Jewish people able to keep this thing?
It's such a fascinating question. I think ultimately there's a lot in Judaism that's very universal and hard to argue with. So there's a lot of value and belief about, what makes life a good life. Family, friends, helping other people out, being a good person, being kind to animals, being responsible in the environment, all these really wonderful values that we really treasure.
Yeah.
There's also the fact that, and I think this is often not talked about enough, being Jewish is really fun and meaningful.
Yeah.
And we like it. We love our holidays, and so many people have all these traditions around Passover Seders or around lighting Hanukkah candles or all of these holidays, and they want to pass that on to their children. And really, that's what you need for people to survive is this will to pass it on.
Yeah.
So I meet so many parents who, you know, did lots of Jewish stuff as a kid, then they drifted away from it as a young adult, and then they got married, and then they had a kid, and suddenly, what do they want to do? The Jewish thing again. And it brings them back because they want their kids to have the same memories and the same associations with holidays and festivals that they had. And
Mm.
that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah. It is. It is. Um, do you sort of Is this sort of juxtaposition between the fact that the holidays were, a lot of them were born out of, surviving anti-Semitic incidents, compared with the joyousness of how we feel now? Do you try and teach these both together when you're teaching converts?
It's a good question. I think that might be part of what we call the hidden curriculum. So it's not the thing that we're talking about specifically,
Yeah,
but it's certainly part of it.
it's in there.
I mean, so I think it's important maybe to mention that I come from a very culturally Jewish, very, very secular family. So we did not do any kind of religious observance beyond Chanukah candles and like a 25-minute Passover Seder. I mean, my family was very, very cultural, very proud culturally, but not religiously observant.
Yeah.
And when I was in my 20s, I decided to become experimental with my religious practice and got really, really into it. And I would say that my experience of living a religious life has been incredibly meaningful. So I have this real joy around Jewish learning that I want to give to people. And so I think when people are in my classroom, they can feel that sort of enthusiasm and that excitement about living Jewishly. I hope it's contagious and that
Yeah.
they feel that as well. So that when we're learning about the hard stuff, it's already clear that this is meaningful and worth going through the hard stuff.
Yeah. What have been some of the reactions from your converts when you talk to them about these things? Has it been eye-opening, or have they known this, or maybe they've witnessed anti-Semitism?
I think we were a bit caught off guard with the events of this past summer because I was teaching this wonderful class of students. And there were, of course, those videos of some anti Semitic attacks that had taken place on the street. Verbal attack, not physical, but still it was widely shared on social media. And some of my conversion students saw that, and it really took them by surprise.
Just to clarify, you're referring to the when Hamas and Israel had their conflict in May, and there was an influx in anti-Semitic incidents here in the UK. Is that right?
Yeah, and specifically, there was one particular video of a car driving down a street, and there was some pretty vile anti-Semitic remarks coming from that particular car. And so everyone had seen it and shared it, and suddenly I found myself with conversion students who were saying, I don't know what to do when I see this, and I don't know how to feel when I see this. And it struck me that up until that point, I had been very good at teaching a sort of academic form of anti Semitism. This is what makes up anti Semitism. This is how we can recognize it. But what I hadn't done was help them deal with the emotional side of it. So, what do you do when you feel unsafe? What do you do when you feel insecure? What do you do when something is happening in front of you? Where do you go to report it? And so since then we've put something together to help introduce our conversion students to organizations like the CST in case they need to report something that's actually happened to them. And also sitting with them in the sadness that that's what we need to do. They have a real sense of grief, I think, a lot of the time when they learn about this. That they're so excited about being Jewish, they're so enthusiastic about it. And now we have to deal with some of the issues that come around that. And unfortunately, just like you and I are not going to solve anti Semitism over the course of this podcast, I'm not going to solve anti Semitism with my students, but I can help them express their feelings and help them to know that there are safe places to go.
I think that's really nice, and sometimes you hear there are some Jewish people who it's the, the weight of experiencing and witnessing anti-Semitism can sometimes feel so heavy. It can sometimes weigh you down. Some people, and I can't blame them, they sometimes develop this fatalistic attitude of, well, it's never going to get solved. They're just going to hate us. Why bother? And I try and say, you know what, progress does get made. Even if it's one person that gets helped, that's something. And I like the fact that you're emphasizing the importance of supporting people emotionally and mentally, because that's real. That's tangible change from your part.
Yeah, and I also think it's something we haven't necessarily done a great job of acknowledging with our children who are born Jewish and who often experience anti-Semitism when they go off to university, and they're not prepared for it. And we've been having a lot of conversations lately about what we can do to help prepare our students for when they might encounter that.
Yeah. Do you ever worry that though teaching converts is about anti-Semitism is completely necessary, do you ever fear that it's going to put them off at all?
Yeah, I really do. I really do worry about it because, you know, they have a choice. They don't have to do this thing. They don't have to become Jewish. One of the things we often talk about is that Judaism, unlike some other religions, it's not like you become Jewish and you get a fail-safe pass to heaven. I can't guarantee that. What I can guarantee is that for me personally, it's been really meaningful. So that should be some, comfort to them as they're on their journey, that they'll probably find a meaningful life on the other side of this. But they are opting in. And I'm really aware of the gravity of that decision. And so that's why, certainly at West London, we have meetings with our conversion students frequently throughout the course. We make it really clear to them, look, we want what's best for you. And if you go halfway through this course and you think, you know what, this isn't what's best for me, or I'm not ready for this, or I'm not prepared to deal with this, that's fine. You've done a lot of learning. You figured it out. It's not the right choice. What have you lost? Nothing. You've done a good bit of exploring and come to a different conclusion. That's great. So there's no pressure on anyone to go through the course and then definitely go to the Beit Din and get signed up
Yeah, yeah.
to join the tribe. It's not like that.
What does the course actually look like in terms of structure? Is it 16 weeks, an hour a week, and what's like how much of it is the history, how much of it is the modern stuff? To talk me through it.
So we do 3 terms, um, which we label Aleph, Bet, and Gimel. And I teach 2 of those 3 terms at the moment. Aleph is the sort of introductory Jewish beliefs. We do a lot of life cycle, some holidays. So we get people to understand what it is that we expect them to do at home as well as in the synagogue. So come and join us, see our services, all those kinds of things. Bit complicated during coronavirus, but we've managed. Then our Bet term is our history term. So we go straight from the biblical period all the way up to modern day, talking about, what's going on in the community right now. Then in the 3rd term, that's their heavy text term. And it's not just texts, it's also a lot of theology at that point. The idea being that you've learned the basics, you've been going to synagogue now for 6 months, maybe 10 months already at that point. You're ready for the really meaty conversations about God and about Torah and about all of these sort of big, important concepts. But the idea being that there's a lot of discussion. Plus, they have to learn Hebrew, which is not easy. And they're expected to come at every festival and to every Shabbat. It's a lot of work.
It's a commitment.
a huge commitment.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, your wife, Renee, is a
Hmm.
convert herself. How familiar was she with anti Semitism before and after her conversion?
So this is, I mean, she's a great example of someone who comes to West London Synagogue and um, participates in our conversion program because that's actually where she did her program. She is not British, she is Dutch, and like a lot of people at West London, has a didn't have the British experience growing up. So being Dutch, she grew up with a real understanding of how dangerous anti Semitism can be. And so in her circles, there was a very clear, hard line that you do not say anti Semitic things, you do not participate in anti Semitic acts because it led to the murder of, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I mean, the war is just, it's so close in time that the communities in Holland are still rebuilding. So when I talked about it with her, talked about Judaism with her, really, she said, growing up, I only knew one Jewish person. There was only one Jewish person in my class. And her father had emigrated to Holland from Israel in the 80s. So, that wasn't a Dutch family that was, had been there since the war. This was a newer family that had been there. And so when you grow up around monuments to your community's murdered citizens, you have a very different um, relationship with anti Semitism. She always saw it as being incredibly dangerous. However, my wife is also very liberal, very left leaning. And when she came here, I think she was really surprised by how insidious anti Semitism can be in certain circles. Um, and sadly, she had to deal with it on the left. And I'm sure it exists on the right as well. It's just that that's not her area. And I think it's something she's still encountering and still dealing with. And through the process of her conversion, her relationship with anti Semitism has changed because it's now personal. It's not just this dangerous thing that affected other people. It's now this dangerous thing that can affect her and her family as well.
Mm, yeah. Um, I mean, I'm wondering, have you or Renee ever faced anti-Semitism directly in your personal or professional lives?
I had one incident when I was a child where someone said something about, oh, aren't Jews the ones who killed Jesus? And that came right out of left field for me. I did not know about that. Um, and I did have one experience at university when I mentioned to a person I thought was a friend of mine that my father was born in Israel, which brought up a whole series of questions that I wasn't prepared for. So that's in my personal life. In my professional life, I think it's being a rabbi maybe shields me from a bit of anti Semitism because very few people will be openly hostile to the rabbi themselves. I get a lot of questions that maybe show that there was a mistaken belief somewhere that they'd like to unpick. So questions about, did the Holocaust really happen? Or is this just, overblown? And those questions are often coming from kids. And so I have an idea that at home there might be something going on there that would cause the children to ask these questions, but I always take them as genuine and presume goodwill. So I wouldn't call that anti Semitism. It just sort of raises my radar a little bit that maybe there is something going on there.
you became more involved in the religious side of Judaism in your 20s. What sparked this, and what then led you further down this road and think, I think I actually want to do this professionally?
I had an idea in my head of what I was going to do, which was I went to a special arts high school. I was really involved in theater. I did a lot of writing, especially comedy writing. That was like my passion. Um, my parents took me to the Just for Laughs festival in Montreal when I was a teenager because I was just so completely obsessed with stand up and wanted to see it as much as I possibly could. And they really encouraged that. And then I went off to university and I applied to university late, and there was only one program I could find space in at the university of my choice, which was religious studies. And I said, great, I'll take it, thinking that the next year I would transfer into film. And the more I did religious studies, the more I fell in love with it. And the more it forced me to ask really difficult questions of myself, things that I'd never really bothered to think about too much before. And my professor for my first class that I needed to take for my major was a rabbi. And he was saying all of these things about how the Bible was constructed and written and edited. It blew my mind because I thought rabbis had to accept that Moses was a real guy and he went up a real mountain and he really received this stuff from God. And there really was a boat that Noah collected all the animals on. And the fact that that wasn't all there was to religion, that there was this whole other side to it, was really eye-opening. And I didn't quite know what to do with it. And so I went and spoke with that professor, and he encouraged me to go back to synagogue. So I went to synagogue for the first time in years. I remember so clearly that I walked in, and the director of education saw me and said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm here to go to the service." And she went, "Oh, welcome." It was just so surprising that this 20-year-old would suddenly show up
Yeah,
and want to go to services when she'd never expressed an interest before.
right.
Um, and the more I went to services, the more I started to get familiar with things and started making connections with the people in my synagogue. And eventually I had to decide what I was going to do with this religious studies degree. And I approached my rabbi and I said, I think I might want to do this because it involves writing, it involves some performing, in as much as standing in front of a group of people talking is performing. There's some singing to it. I like all of those things. And it kind of seems like it might be a more stable job than stand up,
Yeah,
which, let's face it,
yeah.
it absolutely is. And the more I explored it, the more it seemed like the right thing to do. And so I came to this country, and here we are, 10, 11 years later.
I'm glad you did, but why did you come to this country?
It's a good question. Um, the truth is that I'm secretly British. I know that's very not obvious by the way that I speak or present myself, but my mom was born here, and I figured I had family sort of in Britain, and it seemed exciting and interesting, and I thought that would be a really great place to explore because coming from Canada, Europe was this kind of like mythical place that no one ever saw or went to because it's just so far away and so expensive. And I thought, oh, that'll be a great idea. I'll go there, and then I can see some of Europe. And I think in total, I've been to maybe 3 places in continental Europe, and that's it. I've done a terrible job
Sorry, can
exploring.
I just say, I think it's so funny that Americans and Canadians view Europe as like Hobbiton, where it's like this legendary place. It's not. Like, we have McDonald's, you have McDonald's, it's the same.
Yeah, it actually really took me by surprise, like how, but there are certain things that are very different. Like my town had a Nando's and nobody went to
That is surprising.
it. And then I came here and everyone's like, "Ooh, Nando's,
Yeah.
Nando's." And I'm like, "Yeah, nobody went there in my town."
It's our national cuisine. I'm pretty sure that's what the Queen eats on Boxing Day.
I do admit that there was slightly more culture shock coming here than I was anticipating because I thought we all spoke the same language, and I learned very quickly, no, we don't.
No. Like what?
Um, so on my first bar mitzvah in this country, I was a student rabbi. I'd been here maybe a couple of weeks, and I was invited to take part in this thing for Leobeck College called Shabbat Lech Lecha, which is where students would go out to different communities and they would preach a sermon and talk about coming to the college. So I was at EDRS, invited up to give a sermon, and I addressed the bar mitzvah boy and told him he knocked it out of the park,
Mm,
which I didn't realize was a baseball expression that most people here did not know.
right.
Um, and right after I said it, looking out at all the faces going, huh, that's an interesting choice.
There's a park?
Knocked what out of?
Should we be concerned?
Yeah. It's all right. It happens to everyone. I've
Yeah.
moved on from baseball analogies now.
No, I actually want to get back to EDRS. You were the first female rabbi there.
I
What
was.
was that like? Was that of note to you?
It was really interesting because when a synagogue's been around for 80 years and has not hired a female rabbi when there's been female rabbis for over half that time, it does kind of feel like a choice not to hire a female rabbi. By the time I got the job, I don't think there was anyone in the community that had any questions about whether or not I was, a suitable candidate or whether it was the right choice to be having a female rabbi. I think they moved past that considerably. But I don't think it was something that the external Jewish world knew about Edgeware. So I think when I started saying that I was a rabbi at Edgeware, there were plenty of people who knew the Reformed Jewish world well who were surprised. But I started there as a student and worked there for 4 years before I was actually appointed, and just completely fell in love with the people there, loved the people that worked there, had a fantastic time. But there would be little moments where you would think, oh, okay, this maybe doesn't happen everywhere. So there was one conversation that happened around me. It was uh, after a Shabbat service, and there were two women discussing whether or not I should wear dresses on the bima, whether it would be more appropriate for me to wear a pantsuit. I did not participate in this conversation, but I did think it was interesting that they chose to have this conversation while I was standing right next to them. So there were little moments like that that happened. Um, for the most part, though, it was fairly easy for me, and I am glad because they now have another female rabbi working there, my colleague, the amazing and wonderful Rabbi Debbie Young Summers. And I hope she's had an easy time there, um, because it shouldn't make a difference.
Yeah. I really want to thank you for doing this podcast. Before we wrap up, I want to ask: have you got anything coming up that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, the coronavirus has been really difficult for synagogues. It's difficult to create community when half of your people are online, or more than half. it's really difficult to create community when you're worried about lockdown restrictions coming into place and affecting the kinds of things you can do to help people find their way to meaningful life. So, this is not so much about what I'm doing, but it's kind of a note to everyone that if they haven't checked out their local synagogue or the synagogue they're a member of in a while, now is the time we want to hear from you, because all community leaders are trying to navigate this the best they can, but none of us were prepared for how to do community when we can't even see each other face to face. So I guarantee you, whoever your rabbi is, they want to hear from you, and they want you to know that they're around to support them. I'm pretty sure that no rabbi will be terribly upset with me saying that. And if they are, well, they know where to find me.
Rabbi Emily, thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you so much.